Okay, so today we're talking about chapter 10, which is the research support for the biological perspective in personality psychology. Okay, so we'll be looking at the research that supports this particular perspective. All right, so the biological approach then, our first piece of evidence comes from twin studies. So twin studies, you guys probably remember from other courses that you have taken, particularly from developmental courses. So remember that in a twin study, the goal is to essentially tease apart the relative influence of the environment and the relative influence of genetics on a particular personality trait. So to do that, then we use two different types of twins. So we use the monozygotic twins, also known as identical twins. So remember that they share 100% of their DNA, and we compare them with dizygotic twins. So those are fraternal twins. So twins who are essentially as similar to one another as siblings who both have the same parents. So they share about 50% of their DNA. So remember that we are essentially making the claim here that individual people who are living in the same home, so we're talking about the environment here, so they're living in the same home, that we have held that particular influence relatively constant, okay? So we're making the assumption here that both monozygotic and dizygotic twins have equally similar environments. However, we do know from research that identical twins are oftentimes treated more alike, right, or more similarly compared to dizygotic twins. Okay, so going with those particular assumptions, we are basically looking at trying to tease apart the relative influence of genetics in the environment. So if we're looking at a particular personality trait and we find, for example, that monozygotic twins are more similar to one another compared to dizygotic twins on something like extroversion, for instance, then we can draw a conclusion here that genetics might be more influential, right, in the particular expression of that personality trait, because again, we're making the assumption that the environment is the same for both sets of twins. If, however, we find that dizygotic twins, for example, maybe are more similar compared to monozygotic twins on a particular personality trait, then we might be able to draw the conclusion that maybe it's something more about the role of the environment that influences the expression of that particular personality trait. So this is one of the kind of hallmark ways, right, that biological theorists are using to support their particular approach to studying personality. They're also saying within this particular approach here that the inherited differences that we see, okay, so the genetic differences that we see in terms of personality remain constant over the course of one's life, okay, so that's pretty similar to the trait theorists that we talked about in chapter 7 and 8. And so if we look at, for example, the research on introversion and extroversion, there is literature that basically shows that these differences do stay pretty constant over the course of the lifespan, and the differences that we see between introverts and extroverts start in childhood and then develop into adult behavior styles. So we could look at, for example, what kinds of areas do students study in based on their level of introversion or extroversion. And so students who choose to study in kind of noisy, open areas are more likely to be extroverted. Students who want to study in more isolated and quiet places, more likely to be introverted. And so from the research then we find that, you know, kind of why, right? Like, how do we explain this particular difference? And so when they follow up with the extroverts, they're basically saying that they like to study in those noisy open areas. First, because there is some background noise, right? So there's a large amount of noise there. But then there are also opportunities to socialize, right? So they get to go talk to people as a result of where they choose to study. Whereas with the introverts, when we're asking them, why do you go study in these quiet, isolated places, they are saying that they choose those areas first because they're quiet, and secondly, because it's free from distraction. Okay, so let's look also at some of the literature on happiness ratings, comparing extroverts and introverts. So as you guys can see here, they basically had participants in this particular study. So this is study reference at the bottom here, where they had people look at the course of their day and provide ratings for how happy they are, right, over the course of a typical day. So as you guys can see here, and this is consistent with the facets of extroversion that we described in the Big Five in Chapter 7, that extroverts are more likely to report higher levels of happiness compared to introverts. Okay, so that's relatively consistent here. But we also see that extroverts experience more happiness on the weekends, right? So if you look at when do these happiness ratings spike, it's Fridays and Saturdays. So what's going on those days? Well, gosh, you're socializing, right? You're around friends, you're around people. So extroverts then much happier on the weekends because they're getting more opportunity to engage in the socializing activities. So extroverts more likely to report happiness because they socialize typically more than introverts. And then they're also a lot more sensitive to the rewards that come from socializing. And they enjoy the pursuit of rewards more than introverts do. So that is one potential explanation for this. And relating that back to the behavioral approach system and the behavioral inhibition system that we talked about in Chapter 9. Okay, so that's one of the explanations that we can see here. All right, so let's relate this then to evolutionary theory. Okay, so remember, evolutionary theory is concerned primarily with how can we keep the species going, right? So what are the particular things that are going to enable survival of the species, and then also creating new humans, right? So how are we going to encourage people to mate? So with evolutionary theory, we can look at differences between men and women in terms of what we'll call parental investment. So essentially the idea is that women and men approach the kind of task of finding a mate with very different lenses or very different perspectives. Women, generally speaking, are more concerned with individual men who are going to make a contribution, who are going to basically be an investment, let's say, in terms of helping them to raise a child, whereas men, less likely, right, to go with that investment idea here. So from this perspective then, men and women are selecting mates based in part on what is going to best serve the needs of the human species, and we'll talk about that here in just a second. There is also competition, right? So competition is inherent within this evolutionary theory. So there's competition among the members of one gender, so competition between men and competition between women to secure the opposite sex mate who is going to be the best fit, right? Who is going to be able to provide essentially what they think that they need from that other effect, or from that other gender. So then there's also something within this particular approach, it's called the lipstick effect. And according to the lipstick effect, researchers have found that economic insecurity, so during times when individual people, or even your country or your nation on the whole, are in periods of economic turmoil, that this economic insecurity actually heightens the need to find a mate who has resources, in particular on the part of women. So women then are going to try at least to make themselves more attractive, hence the name, the lipstick effect, right? Going to spend more time on physical appearance so that they will be able to attract such a mate who's going to be able to provide those economic resources. All right, so what are men looking for in women? All right, so for men, they have kind of overall less investment on the parenting side, because men, remember, can father many children, right, in theory. And for men, their goal, at least from an evolutionary perspective, is to pass their genes on to the next generation, and they do this by fathering as many children as humanly possible. So to do that, then, they need to look for particular features in women that are going to enable them, right, to be able to actually do that. So men are looking for women who are going to be able to reproduce, right, so women who have high reproductive value. So generally speaking, this means that they're looking for women who are healthy. In particular, we know, for example, that the female body needs to have a particular percentage of body fat to be able to bear children. So men might be looking for something like a waist-hip ratio. Okay, so generally speaking, 0.7 is considered to be the kind of most attractive. But it's basically an indicator that this particular woman has the physical capacity to be able to carry a child to full term. We're also looking for women who are attractive. So attractiveness, if we're looking at trying to objectively define that, we want symmetry. Okay, so think symmetry in terms of facial features. That indicates, kind of level of genetic fitness, the absence of genetic abnormalities. So we want the attractive physical features, so things like bright eyes, clear skin, someone who is generally speaking fairly healthy. And then we're also looking for women who are younger in age. So as you guys hopefully remember from your developmental psych classes or maybe from biology, that the older that women get, the more difficult it is for women to bear children. And also the more likely it is that you'll have some kind of genetic anomaly in the childbearing process. So younger women, more attractive to men. All right, so what are women looking for? So remember, women are basically looking for someone who is going to be able to provide, right? So to provide those economic resources. Women have considerably more invested in the process of bearing children, not only because they are the ones who endure the pregnancy, right, the 9-month gestation period, but then typically speaking, also women are the ones who are typically involved in the bulk of the child rearing. So they have a lot more invested in securing a partner who's going to be able to provide economically for them. So first thing here, financial resources. So women want men who are going to be able to basically pay, right? It's expensive to have a child, so you want someone who's going to be able to do that. They also are looking for someone who is going to be able to provide some kind of status, right? A position of privilege, a position of power to their children. And then also potentially looking for someone who's like a take charge, right, kind of person, someone who is going to be relatively dominant in social situations and going to be able to translate that into providing for the family. All right, so in terms of potential conclusions here, so if we look at the research findings that support this biological perspective, we find that there are oftentimes smaller differences in terms of the sexual behavior and then also mate preferences. So these differences tend to be smaller in cultures that promote gender equality. So the more equality there is between gender, the less likely it is, for example, that men are trying to father as many children as possible to pass on their genetic material, and less likely that women are going to be exclusively looking for men who can provide for them economically. In these cultures, women might have their own resources to provide for themselves economically, and so they don't necessarily need that from a partner. We also find, though, that the research findings for the preferences, right? So what are men looking for in women? What are women looking for in men? That they are relatively consistent with the predictions that evolutionary psychology does make. There are some exceptions here, right? So some exceptions. So the evolutionary perspective, as you guys can probably guess, is pretty limited, right? It is limited in terms of what are heterosexual couples looking for, right? In the opposite sex gender. The prediction of partner choices based on parental investment really doesn't work when we're talking about homosexual couples. So what are gay and lesbian couples looking for in their partner? The evolutionary theory does not do a good job accounting for that. And then the other exception here is that this evolutionary analysis of mating preferences is not applicable for women who are past their reproductive years. Okay, so thinking, past the age where they can really bear children. And also, what if we're looking too at older men, right, or older adults who are really not interested in raising a family? So it doesn't really apply to those things too. So those are some of the limitations here.